Hello, everybody. My name is Aerielle. It's amazing to follow up from Eileen's study. I'm honored to be here with the Global Fashion Conference. And I'd like to present to you today my project on degrowth implementation in fashion brands. So this is the contents of my presentation today. After a little brief introduction on myself, I'll take you through the literature review and the intent of the study. Take you through the method, followed by two sets of results, the data that aligned with degrowth and the data that deviated and challenged what degrowth meant within fashion. And I'll end with the limitations and the conclusion for this study. A little bit about myself. My name is Aerielle. I did complete my fashion technology degree with the University of Leeds, and I've graduated just a couple months ago. And now I am in my master's for sustainability in fashion with the Academy Mode and Design here in Berlin. And my three key areas of research that I'm going into and that I want to continue with are sustainable fashion business models, or more specifically degrowth, as you can tell by this presentation. And I'm also interested in deeper paradigm level change. So what does it take for us to view fashion and do it or operate within our industry in different ways? And some of the ways that I'm looking into include decolonization and different alternative models of thinking and of generating revenue. Within the literature, when I was researching initially on how can we change fashion, make it different, and that deeper paradigm level change, a lot of research pointed to capitalism and its criticisms. It was a lot of judgment on constantly increasing macroeconomic profit and how that was connected to environmental and social degradation. And this criticism was really strong within fashion as well. And Fletcher and Tam, the authors of the Earth Logic Fashion Action Research Plan, which I encourage everyone to research and to read on their own, it's a beautiful publication. I think that they phrase it beautifully and in one sentence. Fashion's growth focus outpaces the ability of efficiency strategies to mitigate its negative effects. So in other words, what we are doing as an industry in circularity or in other sustainability kind of strategies to mitigate whatever effects we have now are not addressing the root cause of the rate of which we consume and that we produce. And I'm sure as you've encountered in other presentations throughout this conference or in research, that is indeed the key issue and what a lot of these strategies are aiming to kind of mitigate. And this brings about the argument for degrowth. And this is intentionally reducing that macroeconomic profit to increase sustainability. And when this is talked about, it's often seen as a really radical solution to the issue of sustainability or the root issue within fashion. And scholars make sure to explain this idea that it's only applied to the global north or more affluent countries. The second is that it must be democratic or voluntary, as an involuntary reduction is considered a recession. And third, it addresses that root cause again. It's addressing how much resources we are using and limiting that. And that is something that we don't see within corporate social responsibility or even models like circularity. But on the other hand, it's heavily criticized due to its radical nature. It does remain marginalized in discourse and in industry due to those socio-political stigmas. And a lot of scholars comment on the idea that it's connected to anti-consumerism and anti-capitalist ideas. And for that, the implementation knowledge of how we put degrowth into practice for sustainability is very low. And it's often thought of as an overly radical or far off reality from our capitalist current system. And unfortunately, this idea of it being a far off reality is backed by the idea that there are little implementation steps, again, on what this looks like, and specifically what this looks like within a fashion context. There are a plethora of growing bodies of research that are great in demonstrating fashion's need. You know, we all hear every single day or every single time we open a fashion source, we're one of the most polluting industries on the planet. We have all these impacts. But in order to decrease that and implement degrowth, the knowledge on that is lacking. And more than that, there's lacking empirical evidence and empirical examples as to how that is done. And this lack is also replicated within larger literature. There are some studies that explore what degrowth can look like, and of those very limited studies, they come up with these qualities or these traits of what businesses should display when implementing degrowth. But again, these studies, if they are focused specifically on degrowth, only look at what qualities businesses should have rather than the activities they should be implementing or the activities they should be doing in order to bring about degrowth. And again, larger studies are not focused within the fashion context. To sum up what I found, degrowth is not only marginalized and over-theorized, right? It's often spoken of and discussed within research for its hypothetical or theoretical implications and definition. But in addition to that, fashion is also deemed an unnecessary and paradoxical sector for sustainability. I found a growing consensus of research kind of painting fashion as an unnecessary or over-glamorized industry. The idea that fashion is incompatible with sustainability kind of hinders our progress as an industry and as an academic discipline to bring about that sustainable future that we know we all need. And I wanted to challenge that headfirst within this study. And so I asked, how do fashion brands implement the concept of degrowth in their business models? And to more comprehensively answer this question, I came up with 4 dimensions as to how to explore this question. I wanted to find out how brands defined degrowth. I wanted to find out the values that they displayed in attempting to implement this, how they implemented it through specific activities, and the challenges that they faced. And what I employed was a multi-case study where I asked 3 brands, Another Tomorrow, Early Majority, and Lestrange, and I've all gained consent for them to publish their names, which I'm very thankful for. And what I did was I asked through interviews and 1 questionnaire and gathered empirical evidence to demonstrate or answer my question. And I came about selecting these 3 brands through a 5-step methodology, where I first designed these interview questions to answer these 4 dimensions. And I structured them through a semi-structured format. It allowed me flexibility and also the same rigidity in asking each brand the same thing. I selected my brands very carefully, and I found that in a lot of research, degrowth was, again, over-theorized, but not explicitly stated many times. So I needed to find brands that were specifically connected and highlighted as being connected to degrowth, as opposed to just a sustainable fashion brand. I next contacted the brands that I found through that internet search through LinkedIn. And I, again, held those interviews, that questionnaire. In addition to verbal data, I also looked at their sustainability web pages. And I lastly analyzed this data through the NVivo software and a thematic 6-step analysis. So my results were a lot more comprehensive than what I could present to you today. So I come with 2 groups of findings. Those that aligned with what degrowth was identified as and its definition in literature, and the data that deviated from that definition and challenged what degrowth means in fashion. So beginning with alignment, I found that all 3 brands had very strong and positive values, right? We see a lot of sustainability brands now displaying their sense of responsibility. They had strong awareness. They were ethical in their intentions and very transparent about their journeys. And they were also competitive with those who were deemed unsustainable. They wanted to constantly do better and make better products as well. And the most significant finding within those values is that they were highly critical or contained or maintained a negative industry awareness. And what I mean by negative is that they opposed the conventional fashion industry and they opposed conventional unsustainable practice. And Lestrange puts it this way: we need to move to a place where we produce less and buy better. So thus, at their core, degrowth fashion brands are against fashion as usual. And the second idea that aligned with degrowth were the actions, or how they implemented the concept. And there were two strands of strategies that they maintained. First were product related, and this was ideas of repair, resale, and design techniques. But what was also interesting to see was that these brands implemented larger brand-wide actions. Now, these were actions that were more radical and larger in scope, and they collaborated with other companies. They aimed to build their communities surrounded on degrowth itself. They were building not just followers, but supporters. They aimed to re-educate, and they wanted to share that message. And there was a large sense of activism there that was very interesting to see, because this goes beyond what is often thought of as a business, especially within fashion. What was most significant, obviously, was the way that they reduced or minimized material-related profit, and that was through alternative growth forms. Early Majority in particular, and I encourage everyone to go look them up, they're an amazing brand. They employ a membership model. So instead of basing profit on how much products you sell, it's based on how many members you have, and members would pay a yearly fee to access lower prices to their core collection, in addition to other benefits. And the other two brands, respectively, have different profit-related strategies of increasing their resale and decreasing the amount of primary products they sell, as well as reducing promotional sales throughout the year. Now we come to deviation and challenges of degrowth. And the first, and very common, is that businesses still need some sort of growth coming in. And this started or manifested first with the way that brands defined degrowth to begin with. They agreed, yes, it involves making and buying less, but they also explained how buying less meant buying better, and buying better meant buying their products, for an example. And I interpreted this as an innate need for businesses to still sell at the end of the day. Next, brands were also highly competitive. And I know that this was also interpreted as something positive within the alignment section, but it can also be negative. If brands are continuing in that capitalistic competitive idea of always selling more or taking more market share, it can be seen as a more profit-related focus. Although it was mainly positive in terms of competing with those unsustainable competitors, it can be something that deviates from a normal degrowth perspective. And last, there were obvious financial challenges that these brands were facing, and that they were very open with me in explaining. A lot of these brands were relatively young, and I'll explain that in a little bit. They needed to satisfy their investors for their returns, and they needed initial capital to fund different degrowth initiatives and projects, whether that was launching a resale program or investing in new technology for product development. Finances are still very much needed within or the backstage of fashion brands. And the last idea of what deviated from degrowth was that it was still very much in progress. So yes, it was present, but it was still in its nascent form. These brands were all under 10 years old, which was a significant finding, and that also kind of plays into the limitations of the study a little bit. Early Majority and Another Tomorrow are both under 3 years old, and Lestrange is about 10 years old. So they're still working from small teams, and each brand has their own limited capacity. And the idea of reaching a financial point where they no longer need to make more money is still a far off reality. And it's still something that brands, or these brands, are working towards. So in the eyes of degrowth, it's still a future goal. And with that, a lot of their initiatives and a lot of their programs and ideas that they had towards degrowth and sustainability were still very much in progress. And some of their strategies, like circularity, repairing, the durability of products, did not exactly aim to reduce profit. And I give the example of circularity here, and that goes against what literature is saying, and that degrowth aims to reduce the amount of materials that you use. But some of these strategies that brands were listing in terms of their degrowth strategy did not limit resource use. And the last point that I put here was that degrowth is a scary idea. When you communicate it to a consumer, it means having less. It means having less probably means for living. In a corporate context, that's having less profit to support your investors and employees with, and it's having less means for competition. And with that, the main limitation of this study is that most of these companies fell short of this pure academic idea of what degrowth is. So yes, they are still working towards reducing material-derived profit and, in a sense, reducing their profit to a sufficient or manageable state, but that was not their first priority. The second thing is that this study is only based on 3 fashion brands. And yes, there were many other brands that were asked. However, more studies need higher amounts of companies and brands within empirical research. And last, this study doesn't comment on the company's economic sustainability as a whole, and economic sustainability was only viewed within this study through the lens of degrowth. So I want to leave with this main idea to conclude. Brands did reflect early degrowth development within fashion. And I think this is so important to disseminate and to reiterate within research and within education. Degrowth is happening. Sustainability is possible. And it may not look like what we think it will look like within an academic context. And that's why I think empirical research and empirical results are so important. You know, those studies and surveys, even in other delegates today, it was so important to see what people are actually saying and what businesses are actually doing in order to make that mind or that map for the future. So with that, degrowth in fashion may involve degrowing those who are unsustainable. Fashion is a very unique industry where it's constantly competitive and retransforming itself with every season. And to begin degrowth within this industry, it may involve shrinking those companies that have an unsustainable or large unsustainable impact and influence. It can involve implementing alternative growth forms as opposed to just reducing profit outright. So these companies were finding different ways to have alternative streams of income that weren't related to material extraction. And last, degrowth in fashion will, not may, it will involve opposing fashion as usual, or it will involve us as an industry, as a collective, and for individual brands to oppose business as usual. And last, the importance of further research for this topic is critical. We need to redefine what degrowth will look like in fashion and continue these ideas and finding what alternative growth can look like. And again, repeating these sorts of studies with wider arrays of companies, whether that's retailers, distributors, e-commerce, and again, replicating empirical implementation results. These ideas of sustainability or degrowth being a myth within fashion or within general society, these myths can become smaller and smaller and smaller the more research we put out. And it is my honor to present to you this idea today, and I'd like to thank you for listening.